Welcome to the latest episode of the Catalyst Health and Wellness Coaching Podcast. My name is Brad Cooper, and I'll be your host. Have you heard the excuse, or maybe you've used this one yourself, it's because of my genes? It's obviously a convenient and seemingly logical statement, but as we'll learn today, it's simply not true. Our genes are not our destiny. Our guest today is Dr. Kenneth Pelletier. We met back in April when we both spoke at a conference out on the East Coast and then happened to end up sitting next to each other at a special dinner event. I was intrigued by his presentation, and after taking a deeper dive over dinner, I just knew you were going to want to hear from him. His bio is very, very extensive. Let me give you a few of the highlights. First of all, Dr. Pelletier is both a PhD and an MD. That's a rarity, and that tells you a lot right out of the gate. He's a clinical professor of medicine at the University of California School of Medicine, UCSF, and the University of Arizona School of Medicine in Tucson. He's also the director of the Corporate Health Improvement Program, which is a collaborative research program with 15 of the Fortune 500 corporations, and he serves on the boards of multiple health and medical organizations. He's listed in the Who's Who in America, the Who's Who in the World, and he's made several appearances on shows you'll recognize like ABC World News, The Today Show, Good Morning America, the CBS Evening News, 48 Hours, the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour, CNN, Fox News, and CBS Sunday Morning. Dr. Pelletier is the author of 13 major books, including his latest titled Change Your Genes, Change Your Life, The Hope and Hype of Genetics. On the coaching front, if you're listening to this on the release date, then we're just 5 days away from our next Colorado Fast Track certification program and 11 days away from the New Jersey coach training. If they're not full and you happen to want to jump in last minute, please don't wait. Reach out to us right away. Email is results@catalystcoachinginstitute.com. Otherwise, the last two events of 2019 are the first ever Rocky Mountain Coaching Retreat and Symposium in Estes Park, Colorado. That's September 6th to the 8th. And then our final coaching certification fast track weekend in Colorado is November 9th and 10th. All the details and plenty of other supplementary materials are available at catalystcoachinginstitute.com. Now on with the latest episode of the Catalyst Health and Wellness Coaching Podcast. Well, Dr. Pelletier, it's so good to have you on the podcast today. The information you're bringing to us, I think people are just going to wake up and say, wow, I'd heard a little of that before, but this is so intriguing. When you and I had a chance to meet at the conference, last month when we were both speaking, I was just in awe of some of the stuff you were sharing. So really great to have you. Thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I'm looking forward to this.
Absolutely. So the audience knows of your bio, and frankly, it's a very extensive bio from the introduction. Can you give us a brief version of how you ended up on this path from your original days back in med school?
Well, my original research, and again, this would have been in the mid-'70s at the UCSF School of Medicine, really focused on, at that time, there was a debate about whether people could influence the involuntary nervous system. So in the textbooks, you had the voluntary and the involuntary nervous system, and never the twain shall meet. But that never made sense to me, because if you think about it, you can hold your breath, which is voluntary, but at some point your oxygen level drops and your breathing kicks in, and that's involuntary. Or you can hold your eyes open for a period of time until the surface lens dries, and then you'll blink, and that's a voluntary hold followed by an involuntary response. So something about that never made sense to me. And there was a researcher, Dr. Elma Green, at the Menninger Foundation, who had studied what we ended up calling adept meditators. And he basically, these are meditators who would self-inflict major wounds. They would skewer themselves with bicycle spokes during meditation, and they would look as though they were having a vacation on the beach. And he did these studies, but they were very uncontrolled and criticized, and for all the reasons they were dismissed. I heard about them and decided I would replicate those under very stringent laboratory conditions. So I did, and had individuals, one person who learned his ability from being in a concentration camp. Another individual was actually a drug smuggler who learned to control bleeding and pain so that he wasn't discovered and arrested. So that was the mid 70s. And it really, to me, was the beginning of realizing that we have an immense amount of regulatory control over our biology. And now, fast forward 50 some odd years later, what I'm realizing, and starting about 7 or 8 years ago with a research project in genetics and epigenetics, realize that that same degree of self-regulation, influence over mind over body or mind-body interaction that I saw in the mid-70s now holds true for our influence over the expression of our own genes. So that intervening years has been really the development of this. That's one direction. And the second has been in the area of corporate programs, working with Fortune 500 companies to develop and evaluate interventions with clinical and cost outcomes. That's my more conventional research, but I use many of these unconventional methods and interventions in the course of these more orthodox research designs. So those are my, hopefully that's as brief as possible, two parallel paths to this present time.
Very good. Very good. So you mentioned epigenetics. That's obviously a big focus of what you're doing. For those listening who hear that and say, wait, what? Can you describe it in lay terms for us?
Yes. I think the greatest misconception most people have, and most people in the health and medical professions have, is that our genes are like the hard drive in a computer, that they're a set of invariant regulations, rules that govern everything that happens in and on the computer. Epigenetics says, no, that's actually not the case, that our genes are more like an interactive software. So it's more like an artificial intelligence system where we're continually interacting with our own genes in a way that creates expression or suppression. So the expression is that if you have a genetic predisposition to, say, intelligence or to a disease, heart disease or cancer, you can enhance the likelihood of that occurring by doing certain things in your life, or you can suppress that tendency. So this area of epigenetics is really the new science of interacting with our genes second by second, minute by minute, in a way that is actually very powerful and is not the genes are your destiny model that we've grown up with.
I love that. So if we get nothing else out of this conversation, just having that out there and encouraging that your genes are not your destiny is awesome. I love it. I love it. And I noticed, I was watching some videos of you preparing for this interview, and one of your quotes that jumped off the page to me was essentially what you just said. Our genes may indicate a vulnerability to disease, but they cannot predict our future. Could you continue to develop that a little bit and what that concept may mean for health and wellness coaches that are working with clients who the clients are thinking, I'm trapped. This is my genes. This is what my father had or my mother had or my grandparents. How can the coaches address that conversation?
As usual, the best way is through good science, and there's a growing body of evidence, and it's been around for a while. This is not radically new, except we're beginning to have more and more precise research, even with NASA, which we can get into in a little bit. But one of the first studies was done by Bert Vogelstein at Johns Hopkins University, and he studied 7,000 twins over 15 years, and identical twins. And what he wanted to know was if one twin had a disease, did that predict the same disease in their identical twin? Now, if you had a genetic, deterministic, reductionistic model, you'd say, yes, of course, they have the same genes, they're twins, yeah, clearly. So he followed them and he looked at incidence of cancer, heart disease, immunological disorders, irritable bowel, etc. And what he found is that the incidence of a disease in one twin did not predict the incidence in the other twin. So in the case of heart disease, it was 50-50. If one twin had heart disease, the likelihood of the other twin having heart disease was about 50%. For Parkinson's disease, it was actually 5%. If one twin manifested Parkinson's, the likelihood the other one would is 5%. For most cancers, he looked at a number of different cancers. The prediction was about 40%. So in other words, having the same genetic predisposition, because they're living different lifestyles, they're eating different foods, they're under different stress, et cetera, had a major modification of the genetic push toward one disease or another. The other thing that he realized in this now a classic study was that the genetic makeup of one twin would only predict a single disease in the other twin as a possibility. So if you looked at heart disease in one twin and saw heart disease, yes or no, in the other twin, it told you nothing about if the second twin had cancer or irritable bowel or inflammatory disease. So the prediction was only good for one disease. And again, in all the cases we just cited, it was very much of a miss. So that kind of information, I think, for coaches, and there are many studies like that. As I said, there's an excellent study that was just done with NASA. That kind of information really helps to break that mindset of, oh, it's my genes. There's nothing I can do about it. The point is there's everything you can do about it.
Wow, that's tremendous. What was the lead author on that one again?
That was Bert Vogelstein, Vogelstein, Bert Vogelstein at Johns Hopkins University, a true classic study in this area of epigenetics.
Beautiful. All right. I'm sure folks are going to want to pull that up and share it with their clients. So you've been at this, and you mentioned in your introductory comments, 50 years ago, I was doing this. What are some of the biggest surprises as you've been doing this cutting edge research for 5 decades? What are some of the biggest surprises you've discovered along the way that might be news to people that are listening in addition to what you've already shared?
Well, to me, what is so striking is that if you have training in biology or chemistry or medicine or nursing or whatever, chiropractic, whatever your clinical training is, we are all taught a model of biological reductionism, that the mechanisms we can observe and test in biochemistry and in biology is all there is. I mean, that's the basic model. It's a very physical, reductionistic, causal model. And what I've learned is that's simply totally inadequate. It's accurate in some instances, but in very precious few. And the main thing that to me continually surprises me is the degree to which influences internally and externally have a profound influence on our health, on our life expectancy, which is a very different kind of surprise. Most people assume their life expectancy is governed by genetics. It's not, which I find to be really fascinating. So these things that we consider to be invariant, things over which we have no control or influence, are in fact influenceable by things like meditation, adversely by stress. Diet has a profound impact on genetic expression. Our psychosocial interactions with friends, so people that have connections to others, family, friends, church groups, whatever social groups you have 1/10 the incidence of heart attacks as people who don't. The interaction with our physical environment has a very direct causal impact on our genes. So my book title, Change Your Genes, is actually a gotcha title. Genes don't change. They can be damaged by radiation. They can be damaged by hormone disruptors that come from basically reared animals that are reared for slaughter, or they can come from exposure to petrochemicals. And I think the current controversy with Roundup and Monsanto is a clear example. Glyphosate, which is the active agent in Roundup, is a known carcinogen. It is classified as such by the World Health Organization. The United States EPA has failed to echo that. But there was a study 2 months ago looking at plankton in Antarctica, and that's a pretty esoteric study. But they looked at plankton, and what they found is that glyphosate is in the organism of every single plankton entity in Antarctica. So we have a pervasive carcinogenic agent. We've basically poisoned the planet. That has a direct impact on our genetic expression. And of course, pharmacology has a huge impact on whether or not genes express themselves and how. So those kinds of subtle, multifactorial influences that we encounter and we manifest every day of our lives, and the profound impact it has on our health, our longevity, is to me astounding. I mean, I remain in awe of the extent to which this occurs even now.
Was there a time when you, and I guess you slightly alluded to this in the very first question, but was there a time when the light bulb just went off and you said, oh, man, this is it. Like, this is the direction I want to take in my research because of the impact it can have long term? Do you remember something that caused that to click?
Yeah, I do, actually. Great question. Hadn't thought about that. But the first person that I studied at UCSF, and this is going back to the Adept Meditator study, was a man named Jack Schwartz. Jack was a healer, a lecturer, a philosopher, and he had learned his autonomic regulation as a prisoner in a Nazi concentration camp. And he had been tortured, and when he was tortured, he fainted, went into a reverie, and in the reverie, he had a visionary experience, and specifically, he saw himself, he was raised as a Catholic in the Netherlands. He saw himself standing at the foot of the cross, and that when Christ looked up into the heavens and said, oh Father, why hast thou forsaken me? Jack said he didn't look up. He looked into the eyes of every person standing at the foot of the cross. And when Jack's eyes met with his eyes, he woke up, came out of his reverie, and said to the Nazi concentration camp officer, I love you. Mm. Now, from that point on, they left him alone. They thought he was completely crazy. But what happened was his ability to control bleeding and pain increased exponentially. So when we studied him in the lab, what he did would be to take a sharpened bicycle spoke, large diameter, unsterilized needle, and he would push it completely through his bicep. Now, this is one of those do not do this at home moments.
Yeah.
And I'd heard about this. I'd seen films of it. I'd been told by Dr. Green and Dr. Kamiya, who is my research advisor, that this was possible. But when I saw him actually do it, and when I looked at the instrumentation we had hooked up to him that showed slow wave activity in his brain, slow heart rate, very regular heart rate, no increase in blood pressure, no subsequent infection, no change in respiration rate or pattern, no other kind of physiological responses we were measuring, I was astounded. And I thought, this is impossible.
Right.
Because everything we know about the autonomic or the involuntary nervous system was being violated by this person entering into a state of meditation. And we had one of the criticisms of the studies is that, well, maybe he's abnormal, or these people are abnormal. They don't bleed or feel pain like the rest of us. So we did standard bleeding time tests and standard pain reaction time and tolerances before they meditated. And in Jack's case, everything was perfectly normal. He bled pain just like all of us. But when he was meditating, he had this profound shift. And the last thing that I'll say that again was this, aha, this is amazing. He said that when he would push the bicycle spoke through his arm, and this is a hard thing to do. There's a lot of tissue. There are major arteries, and it to him if he hit a major artery or not. In fact, in one of the demonstrations, he actually did hit an artery, and it was amazing to watch him close that down like a faucet. He said, it's like, I don't feel the needle. He said, it's like me pressing on my arm with my own finger. There is a sensation there, but it's not a sharp, distracting painful sensation. It's simply an awareness of the fact that I'm doing this with my arm. And again, that has stuck with me to the present day, which shows the amazing power, if you will, that our belief systems and our psychological states have on our health and illness and even longevity.
Yeah, no doubt. No doubt. So let's come back to another thing you're known for saying, and that is our daily activities and choices determine whether those vulnerabilities, we talked about the genes early on, those vulnerabilities are turned on or turned off. What would be some examples of those daily activities and choices, in quotes, that our listeners may or may not be aware of? So, we think of traditional, better nutrition, meditation, you mentioned, exercise, activity levels. Any thoughts or suggestions of things that may not naturally come to mind for a wellness coach or somebody listening to this?
Well, all of those that you've just named have that kind of profound impact. And just backing up for a second, one of the questions that comes up is, how does this happen with a gene? And a gene has a molecular coding. It's called single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, SNPs. And these are they're rheostats that coat the gene. And so all of these influences, stress, diet, physical activity, act like a rheostat. They turn it up or they turn it down. And that's how the gene is enhanced or suppressed in terms of its predisposition. And what I have been really impressed with is how delicate the balance is and how profound the impact is of simple dietary changes. Give you an example. There are dietary assays that look at the influence of diet on genes, and you will find information like eat walnuts, not almonds, because genetically you're not predisposed to digest almonds very well. However, walnuts are really good for you. And so things like that degree of subtlety to me is always very surprising. With physical activity, there was a great study just 2 months ago out of Ireland that looked at 40 professional rugby players versus 40 amateur athletes. And they looked at their genetic biomarkers. And what they found is that the professional athletes, because of having to push and develop skills beyond the general population, all had enhanced, increased biomarkers. So their ability to clear, issues in their intestinal tract was improved, inflammation was reduced, reaction time for their hormones were all increased. So again, this deceptively simple physical activity, albeit at a high level, had a profound and direct impact. So I guess it's all of the factors that you mentioned, but to me, what is most surprising is how subtle and specific this impact is. It's not a general global response. When I go to conferences and I hear about the ketogenic diet, Paleolithic diet, high fat, low fat. Sure. Now there's the celery juice fasting diet that's making the rounds.
Oh no.
I just kind of shake my head and just think it's totally silly, because the reality is there's no one perfect diet. Probably the close diet that comes to being proven and having good data is the Mediterranean diet. And in fact, we find with the people you studied, looking at optimizing their epigenesis, the modified Mediterranean diet is most often characteristic of them. But, there's no perfect diet. And what these assays, what these assessments allow us to do is to say, not what is the perfect diet generally, but what's the perfect diet for you? How does meditation affect your genetic expression? How does physical activity affect you? What is your physical environment doing in terms of promoting your health or well-being or not? So I guess the bottom line, if you will, is precision medicine or personalized healthcare is really coming. That's the future. That's the future that I see in the next 2 to 5 years.
And that's really exciting. And you spoke about that at the conference, and it definitely raised the energy in the room as you were talking about that. What in the meantime, as we're kind of sort of waiting for that, and I know not everybody's waiting for it, there are some options there, but on a practical level for the everyday person over the next 2 to 3 years before this becomes more broadly utilized. How do people individualize that? So I start exercising. What are there things I can be looking for, or I try a different eating plan that's more similar to the modified Mediterranean diet? What would I be looking for that would tell me without doing the biomarker checks that it's having a positive impact?
Well, there are a lot of subjective measures, and by the way, these assays are available now. I mean, there are about 7 or 8 testing companies that do a very good job. In fact, one of them that I work with, they don't have, by the way, I don't have any proprietary, just for disclosure purposes, I don't have any proprietary or for-profit relationship to any of these companies. It's really an objective assessment. But one of them I work with has actually provided me with a code that I could give to your listeners or give to you that would give them a 30% discount from one of them looking at these assays. So the assays exist now, and they're going to be getting better over the next 2 to 3 years. Prices are dropping. I think pretty soon they'll be literally kind of over the counter. Now, in the interim, I think one thing, for instance, with dietary intake, most of us race through meals. We race onto something else when it's over, and we fail to notice the impact of what we have just eaten. So if you wait about 30 minutes after you've had a meal, it could be a quick meal, but just check in 30 minutes later. How are you feeling? If you're feeling lethargic, if your attention is wandering, you don't feel quite as sharp as you did, it means that something you just ate is adverse. It's not good for your body. It doesn't matter if it tasted good, you like it, it's a favorite food, it means it's had an adverse effect on you. So just paying attention to the impact of what you're eating on your mood, on your mental state, is a great barometer, absent these kinds of assays, which are objective and precise, of how to evaluate your diet. In terms of physical fitness, it's not so much a matter of, oh, I'm going to go out there and run because it's going to prevent a heart attack. That does not last. Fear is a poor motivator for anyone on anything. So the trick with any physical activity is mixing it up, doing different things so you're not bored by one particular exercise, and doing something that you really enjoy, and doing it at least 2 or 3 times a week for anywhere between 15 and 30 minutes. The other thing that the more current research is finding is what's called interval training. So instead of elevating your heart rate up to a sub-maximal level of aerobic exercise and maintaining that, the best thing is actually 3 to 4 minutes of maximal exertion, followed by 3 to 5 minutes of decreased and in effect rest exertion, then back up to 3 to 5 minutes of peak exertion. And you cycle through this peaks and troughs for about 12 to 15 minutes. That's what's called interval training, and turns out to be the best in terms of cardiovascular health, weight loss, and general muscle tone for individuals. So suddenly this onerous, oh, I've got to go out and exercise 3 times a week, 30 minutes, and goes away. And my best suggestion for people in terms of monitoring that is, how do you feel? Do you feel better or worse? Does it sharpen you? Does it increase your energy or not? And that will tell you how well that is happening. I guess the last thing would be if you're concerned about environmental exposure, and again, it's in terms of air quality, soil quality, foods, radiation, is how do you feel when you're in your home? Some people walk into their own home and they feel badly. So it's kind of a toxic environment, and it may be off-gassing from components of the house. Or you walk into your workplace, and you feel suddenly kind of either lethargic or disoriented or not as energetic as you did. It may be because the air recycling is very poor in that office building. So I guess the bottom line is just pay attention to the impact of all of these influences on you, and that will tell you a great deal about what to do or not do to enhance your health.
I love it. That, especially the fueling piece, the nutrition piece of, okay, pause 30 minutes afterwards. How are you feeling? That's a great indicator, and it's something every one of us can be doing. I love it. Before I forget, you mentioned that the discount code, that you don't have any conflict of interest there. That'd be great if you don't mind sharing that, and folks that are listening might want to tap into that a little bit.
Yeah, and one of the 7 or 8 companies is a company called Day2, Daytwo, day2.com. And Day2 is a 10-year-old company that was founded out of the Weizmann Institute in Israel. Now, the Weizmann Institute is one of the world's great nutritional sciences centers. So the thing I like about Day2, the science is solid. And they're just coming into the United States, I think in the last year. They have an office in the East Bay in Northern California, and they've just begun to make their assessment available. So it's day2.com, and when you go log on to purchase it, I think it's around $250. The last time I looked, I think that's the price. Okay. If you put in Pelletier, my name, Pelletier 30, Pelletier 30, as a code, you'll get a 30% discount.
Perfect.
And it's just that because I've worked with them and I talk about them when I've got them in my PowerPoint, as you saw at the conference, they like that, obviously. And they said, well, let's provide you with the means for people to get access to this at a reduced price. So that's a good one. And it gives you very detailed information. So for people concerned about weight loss or food sensitivities, certainly if you're pre-diabetic, this is a life changer. Or if you are diabetic, if you're a type 2 diabetic and you're having difficulty really determining best foods on your diet, this Day2 is perfect. It is the best thing I've ever seen out there. And one of the things that has occurred with patients in our cardiology clinic at UCSF is people will come in and say, I'm following the guidelines. I'm just not getting results. And most of the doctors think, oh, they're lying or they're not following the guidelines because I'm not seeing changes in their blood markers. And when we have subjected them to the genetic testing, what we find is that, yes, they are following the guidelines and the guidelines are not working. That's what's so important. So I'll give you one example. If I ask you now, is a banana or an Oreo cookie less likely to spike your blood sugar? Which one would it be? So most people would say banana will spike your blood sugar less. The cookie will spike it more. It turns out for about 30% of people that eating a banana, it actually will spike your blood sugar more than a cookie. Now that is a shocker. That's not something that we can be aware of. We may or may not be aware of that even in the method we talked about of paying attention to the aftermath of what you consume. But that's the kind of information that you can get from these dietary assays. So again, Day2, it's a good one. If your listeners have an interest, that's one that I would really recommend.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay. Confusing question for me that you mentioned during the conference. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I'd like to have you at least touch on it for us. And that is the generational epigenetic changes. So how the choices I make today can influence our kids and potentially grandkids. And I'm assuming this is post-birth, like the connection as a woman's pregnant or as the couple is growing up and they're about to have children. I can see that, but I struggle with understanding how my choices after the kids are born outside of modeling actually can influence them and maybe even grandkids. Can you talk us through that a little bit?
Yes. Well, one of the things you're pointing out is if a woman is pregnant, if you have a pregnancy in your family, what you do by way of genetic expression before, during, and after the pregnancy, even after the pregnancy, will have a direct impact on the child. So your changes, if you will, if you make positive changes in genetic expression through all the things we've been talking about, that will be transmitted to the fetus in utero, and you will have a child that has a push in a more positive epigenetic direction. So that's very clear. The other part that you're talking about is something that's really quite surprising. It's called transgenerational epigenetics. And what that means is some genetic pushes actually skip a generation, which is pretty amazing. Where this was discovered was in looking at the epigenetics of the survivors of Nazi concentration camps. The hypothesis was that the offspring of the survivors should have a hyperarousal because of the genetic push that the parents had in the concentration camps. Turned out that's not the case. But then they looked at the grandchildren, and what they found is the grandchildren did have a hyperarousal tendency toward highly stress reactive conditions. Now, why that's the case, no one is certain, except the fact of, again, this modification factor. So maybe the parents or the offspring of the survivors of concentration camps were more loving, more caring. They were taken care of. The survivors did not want their children to suffer, and therefore that was not expressed in their genes. But then the third generation, the parents forgot about that, just let the children be reared on their own and had this hyperarousal. There was also a recent study, which I thought was fascinating. Again, it came out after my book was published, but it was from the University of Cork in Ireland. They looked at predisposition to obesity, and they looked at grandparents, both maternal and paternal grandparents, and they wanted to know, did their weight have a predictive impact on their children? The answer was no, kind of surprising. But what was even more surprising is they looked then at the third generation, so the grandchildren. What they found is on the patrilineal side, so grandfather to son to grandson, there was no prediction. That didn't really, that whether grandfather was heavy or not didn't matter. However, for the grandmother to female child to the female grandchild, there was a high predisposition to obesity. So if the grandmother was obese, the mother was not necessarily obese, the grandchild had a strong push toward obesity. So somehow that skipped an entire generation and manifested in the third generation. So there's a whole subset of research going on now looking at these kinds of odd transitions and inherited values that seem to skip generations and show up in subsequent ones.
Interesting. Wow. All right, let's turn the mirror around here for a second. What is one or a couple, if you'd like, interesting ways that you're applying your research in a way that might surprise our listeners?
Well, I mean personally.
Yeah, just in your life, in Dr. Pelletier's life, what are you doing with your research to garner the benefits?
Well, I have modified my diet based on these assays. I always try them first before I recommend them to patients or to listeners or people like your coaches. I've changed my diet. I do have a protein drink every morning, and give you an example. I had low-fat dairy as the main liquid, and I switched from low-fat dairy to rice stream because I thought, well, that's healthier, lower in fat, et cetera. When I did my assay, it turns out that rice stream really spiked my blood sugar. So I switched back to low-fat dairy, and in fact, now the glycemic response stays relatively flat. So that's, one change. But I do have, a protein drink. I certainly, I've meditated literally since I was 18, and I continue that on a daily basis. And I think that the meditation allows us to go inside and to look at the point of view from which we're making choices about our life, about our beliefs, about what we do. And if we have a point of stillness from which we make those decisions, I think they're better, they're clearer, they're more benign. So I do continue a meditation. I'm physically active. Here in San Francisco, it's fairly easy. So I swim, I surf, I do some running, although I don't enjoy it. So I don't do very much of that, but I stay, physically active. And the other is that I really love my work. I mean, I love what I do. And if I didn't, I would stop. And I think if you do what you love, that's a critical factor in genetic expression. I think that really enhances the ability of our body and mind to optimize health. And I think the last thing is I really become more cognizant of spending time with friends and family. I mean, time is the one thing that is our most valuable possession. It's the one thing you can't get more of. We can't get more time. And yet how much time we squander or don't use in a way that's productive and positive. I've really become aware of that in the last 4 or 5 years. So it's more time with friends, more time with family. And I just think that that's made, at least for me, a huge positive difference. So those are, some of the things that, on a daily basis that I'm doing differently.
That's a great list. It's nice to know that you're applying what you're talking about, and it's not just do what I say and not what I do. All right, so now you get a chance to design a billboard. It's going to be on the busiest street in the country. What would it say? Any message you want to portray?
I think in your one of your early statements actually captured a phrase I really like, which is genes are not your destiny.
Love it.
If there's one message that I would convey to people, which is you are not a victim of genes. They do not govern your state of health. They do not govern your longevity. And everything that you do makes a difference in terms of manifesting health and long life expectancy for yourself. And so my main message on a billboard would be genes are not your destiny. Be a good bumper sticker.
I love it. I love it. All right, Dr. Pelletier, I appreciate you joining us. Any final words of wisdom for the coaches that are out there working with folks that they just want to get better? They want to improve their lives, their futures. Any kind of summary things you'd like to leave us with that maybe we haven't brought up yet?
Well, I just want to commend coaching as a profession and commend your coaches in particular, because in all of our research with corporations and the corporate program I've run for 30 years includes the corporate members are American Airlines and IBM, Ford, Dow, Lockheed Martin, Apple, Oracle. They're really Prudential. They're really blue ribbon companies. In all of our interventions, we use health coaching. So because it's inherently less expensive, we develop the computer algorithms, and then the coaches interact with the people using the computer algorithms to really counsel them, to really help the people make better life choices. And we've changed the lives of, literally tens of thousands of employees through the skills of the coaches. So I have, immense respect, and I'm a real advocate, if you will, of the coaching model to improve health. And I think we'll see more of this. Telemedicine is becoming more acceptable, certainly in the work site. And I think there's a bright future, and I commend every coach for the impact they have.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Great way to wrap up. Thank you again for joining us. This has been fantastic.
Thank you for the invitation. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Absolutely. Genes are not our destiny. What an encouraging and, I would guess, in some cases, life-changing message. Just another thank you to Dr. Kenneth Pelletier for joining us. For those of you who are coaches and are considering a move in that direction for your career, did you hear what he said about that at the end? I wrote it down. In all our interventions with blue chip companies, we use coaching. We've changed the lives of literally tens of thousands of employees through the skills of the coaches. That's you? Congratulations. That's awesome. How's that for encouragement from somebody who's in there getting it done? Great stuff. If you want to talk about how to earn your wellness coach certification, if you're one of those folks on the fence who's just been pondering a little bit, you know where to find us. results@catalystcoachinginstitute.com. We're happy to set up some time to discuss your situation, answer any questions you might have, wherever you want to take it. In the meantime, there are plenty of resources, including some special reports you may not have known that we have on things like business development, clinical integration, and those kinds of things. And you can find those on the website at catalystcoachinginstitute.com. Thanks for joining us. Thanks to those of you who've gone the extra mile to actually subscribe to the podcast and maybe even leave a review. The audience continues to grow. We're not doing advertising, so that's on you, and we appreciate it. Thanks for doing that. Now let's go get better. We're not chasing perfection. We're stepping into better, one day at a time. Thanks for being a part of the Catalyst Tribe. and I'll look forward to speaking with you soon on the next episode of the Catalyst Health and Wellness Coaching Podcast.